My name is Lena Vasic, and I was 29 years old the afternoon my Aunt Gordana looked across the holiday table, tilted her head the way she always did when she was about to say something that would stay with you for months, and said, 29. Nothing to show for it. She didn't whisper it. She said it clearly, the way people say things they believe so completely they don't think to lower their voice. My Aunt Petra nodded. My Aunt Biljana refilled her glass. I didn't argue. I didn't push back from the table. I looked at my plate, and I thought about the folder sitting in my car, the one with the stamped approvals, the site surveys, the phased planting schedules, and I decided the table didn't need to know about it yet. What my aunts didn't know, what almost no one in my family knew, was that I had already left a mark on this state that none of them could see unless they walked through a park, looked down at a path, and thought, someone designed this. That folder in my car had something to do with them. More specifically, it had something to do with a garden they were paying someone else to build. I'll tell you how that unrolled. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. Drop a hello in the comments and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. My grandmother's name was Vera. She was the kind of woman who kept a garden the way some people keep a promise, with patience, with stubbornness, and with the understanding that good things take longer than you think they should. Her yard in Millbrook, the mid-sized city in the upper Midwest where our family had settled 2 generations back, was not large. It was a narrow strip along the back fence, maybe 40 feet end to end, with a gravel path down the center and raised beds on either side. She grew tomatoes, a few herbs, some roses she'd carried as cuttings from her own mother's house. The roses were the thing. Every summer they came back a little more sprawling, a little more insistent, and Grandma Vera treated that as evidence of something she never quite put into words. She died in October, 2 years before any of this happened. She was 81. Her health had been declining for a couple of years, and the end came the way ends tend to come, not as a surprise, but still as a shock. She left behind a small house, a substantial amount of goodwill in the family, and a yard that, without her attention, began to go quiet over the following seasons. I had been close to her. Closer than most of the cousins, I think, though I'd never have said that at a family gathering. We had an understanding, Grandma Vera and I, built over years of Sunday afternoons when I was a teenager, and she would let me sit at her kitchen table and draw while she read. She never asked what I was drawing. She never said, "That's nice, but what will you do with it?" She just let the silence be a room we both lived in, and I think that silence is a large part of the reason I became what I became. I became a landscape architect. I know how that sounds to people who didn't study it. I know what the word architect does in a sentence, and I know that when you attach landscape to the front of it, a certain percentage of the population quietly reclassifies you as a gardener with pretensions. My family was in that percentage. My Aunt Gordana, who was the oldest of my mother's 3 sisters and the gravitational center of most family opinions, had a particular way of describing my work that I heard more times than I can count. Lena draws plans for gardens, she would say. Or, when she was being more dismissive, Lena draws pictures of parks. And in her voice, the word pictures carried about as much weight as doodles. The truth was more interesting than that. I had graduated 6 years earlier from the state's largest architecture and planning program with a landscape architecture degree and a minor in civil systems. I had spent 2 years working for a mid-sized firm in the city, a firm called Halverson and Briggs that did a mix of residential and public sector work. And then, for years before the events I'm about to describe, I had left to start my own practice. My own practice. That was a phrase my family couldn't seem to locate on any map they recognized. My Aunt Petra, who had worked in hospital administration for 20 years and measured professional legitimacy in org chart terms, once asked me who my boss was. When I told her I didn't have one, she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as concerned, the same expression she might use if I'd told her I'd been eating only 1 meal a day. "But who do you report to?" she said. "The client," I said. "And who checks your work?" "The city," I said. "And the state licensing board, and the structural engineers, and the contractor, and the inspector." She nodded slowly, in a way that did not indicate understanding. My practice, which I had named Vasic Design Studio, because I was 25 and thought simplicity was a virtue, had grown steadily, if not loudly. By the time of the holiday dinner, where my aunt made her comment about 29 and nothing to show for it, I had 3 completed public parks in the state to my name, 2 residential estates, a schoolyard redesign that had won a regional planning award, and a 4th public park under construction in a suburb about 40 miles from Millbrook. I also had a contract that I had not told my family about. I'll come back to that. None of this was visible to the aunts. I drove a 6-year-old car. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that my Aunt Biljana had once described as up and coming, which, in her vocabulary, was a polite way of saying not yet arrived. I didn't own a house. I didn't have a husband. I didn't have a title that printed neatly on a business card in the way that Director of Operations or Senior Registered Nurse did. What I had was a state landscape architecture license, a growing portfolio, and a reputation in the planning and municipal design world that was quietly becoming solid. But solid reputations in specialized fields are invisible to people who aren't in those fields. My family wasn't in that field. And so, to them, I was 29, living in a rental, driving an older car, doing something with drawings that they couldn't quite picture, and having, in the summary judgment of the holiday table, nothing to show for it. I want to be fair to them here. I want to tell you what I actually think, rather than painting a picture of 3 villainous women who gathered in a room to be deliberately cruel. My aunts were not villains. They were women who had grown up in a family that measured safety in the forms they knew: the paycheck, the pension, the house, the degree on the wall. They had watched their parents work hard for visible things, and they had spent their own lives accumulating visible things, and when they looked at me, they saw someone who hadn't accumulated the things they recognized. That scared them, I think. Or maybe it just confused them. The cruelty, and it was a kind of cruelty, I won't pretend otherwise, was not born from malice. It was born from a framework they'd never had reason to question. That doesn't mean it didn't land.
It did.
Every time. The holiday dinner I mentioned, this was the November after Grandma Vera had been gone for 2 years. The family had gathered at my Aunt Gordana's house, which was large and well kept in the way that houses become when their owners have spent a great deal of time and money and attention making sure everything signals that the right choices were made. The kitchen had been recently renovated. The dining table seated 14 comfortably. There were good plates, good glasses, a meal that had been planned and prepared with obvious care. I had arrived on time, which I always did, and had spent the first hour helping in the kitchen, not because anyone asked me to, but because it was something to do with my hands, and it meant I was standing at the counter rather than sitting in the living room fielding questions about my apartment and my car and my plans for the future. My mother was there. My father had been out of the picture since I was 15, not dramatically, not with any great rupture. He had simply moved to a different state and gradually become a Christmas card, and then a birthday text, and then something I barely thought about. My mother had stayed, and had her own relationship with the aunts, which was warm but slightly deferential in a way I had watched my whole childhood and never quite figured out. At some point in the late afternoon, before the meal, I sat down at the table to look at something on my phone. I had a message from a client about a site measurement I needed to confirm, and my Aunt Gordana sat down across from me, and my Aunt Petra sat down beside her, and my Aunt Biljana came in from the living room and stood at the corner of the table, and it wasn't engineered, exactly. It was just the way the afternoon had pooled. The subject of what I was doing came up the way it always came up, not as an attack, but as a worry. "How's the work going, Lena?" And then the answer, which was genuinely good. I had the 4 parks, the schoolyard award, the thing I hadn't told them about, but which I gave, as I always did, in terms that were accurate but understated, because I had learned that overstating my work in front of the aunts produced skepticism rather than respect. They would nod and then, within a few exchanges, return to asking whether I had considered going back to school for something more practical, or whether I knew that Petra's colleague's daughter had just been made a regional manager at a logistics firm, and wasn't that something? I don't remember the exact chain of conversation that led to the moment. I just remember that at some point the question shifted from, "How is work?" to "Where do you see yourself?" and somewhere in the navigating of that, the comment came out. 29 and nothing to show for it. Gordana's voice. Completely even. Not contemptuous. She would have said it was concern. She probably believed it was concern. Petra nodded in a small, sad way, as if this was a diagnosis they'd been carrying for some time, and it was a relief to finally say it out loud. Biljana refilled her coffee. My mother, at the other end of the table, looked at her plate. I looked at my phone. The client's message was about a site at the edge of Millbrook, a project I'd been brought on to about 8 months earlier that was now past approvals and moving toward contractor selection. The project was the memorial garden the family was building to honor Grandma Vera. I had not told them. I had been hired not by the family directly, but by the landscape and memorial planning firm the family had contracted, a company called Birchfield Memorial Design, which was one of the regional firms that handled the design and project management of commission memorial gardens, small parks, and commemorative public spaces. When Birchfield had been awarded the garden contract by my aunts, who had organized the project among themselves, pooling contributions from the extended family to create a permanent public memorial in a small pocket park adjacent to the community center Grandma Vera had volunteered at for 30 years, Birchfield had, in turn, subcontracted the design work to the firm they most frequently used for this scale of project. That firm was Vosich Design Studio. I had received the brief in late winter, almost 10 months before this dinner. The brief described the garden's purpose, the site dimensions, the city's approval requirements, the budget, and the client's key preferences. The client name on the brief was Birchfield Memorial Design. The end-use memorial name, in a small note near the bottom of the brief, was listed as the Vera Povich Memorial Garden. Povich was my grandmother's maiden name, which she had used publicly throughout her life. I had sat with that piece of paper for a long time. Then I had accepted the contract. I had reasons for not disclosing it to the family. Some of them were professional. Birchfield had not specifically identified my family relationship, and I wasn't certain they knew it, and I did not want to introduce a complication that might affect the project's timeline or their confidence in the subcontractor. Some of them were practical. The project was already approved and in motion, and I was deep into the design phase by the time I'd fully processed who the memorial was for. And some of them were something else. Something quieter. A recognition that I was being given an opportunity to do something for my grandmother with my actual skills, in the way I actually worked, and that the result would speak for itself without any context I had to provide. So, I didn't provide any context. I just worked. The design I had developed was, I think, the best work I had done at that point in my career. I had approached it the way I approached all my public commissions, with a structural clarity and a softness in the planting plan that I hoped made the space feel like something that had always been there, rather than something installed. The central path was a gently curving gravel walkway that widened at the middle into a small sitting area with a low stone bench and a planting bed. The bed was anchored by climbing roses, the variety Grandma Vera had grown, which I had confirmed through 2 phone calls with a horticulturalist and one with a nursery that carried heritage varieties. The perimeter plantings were layered for seasonal interest, so that the garden would have something happening at every point in the growing calendar. The stone bench bore a simple inset plaque. The whole thing, installed, came to $48,000, under budget, which Birchfield's project manager had noted with approval. The plans had been approved by the City Planning and Parks Department 5 weeks before this dinner. The contractor had been selected 3 weeks before. His name was Tomasz. He was due to meet with the family. My aunts had organized themselves as the decision-making committee for the project in the second week of December to walk through the design plans, confirm the timeline, and begin scheduling the site work. I had that meeting on my calendar too. The thing about being underestimated over a long period of time is that it stops being dramatic. It becomes ambient. It's there the way a low-grade noise is there. You stop noticing it consciously, but it accumulates somewhere below your awareness, and you carry the weight of it without always being able to name what you're carrying. I had been carrying my family's assessment of me for most of my adult life. It had started, I think, when I didn't take the path they expected. My cousin Natalija, Aunt Petra's daughter, 18 months older than me, the cousin who'd been held up as a kind of model throughout my adolescence without anyone meaning any specific harm by it, had gone to business school and was now a manager at an insurance company. My cousin Dragan, Gordana's son, had an engineering degree and worked for a firm that designed industrial systems. These were legible trajectories. You could explain them at a dinner party in 2 sentences, and the listener would nod and know where to place the information. My trajectory had not been legible. When I graduated high school, I told my mother I wanted to study landscape architecture. She hadn't known it was a degree. She thought I meant something like horticulture or garden management. When she understood what it actually was, a 5-year accredited professional program, with courses in site engineering, grading and drainage, environmental systems, and urban design theory, as well as the design work, she was cautiously supportive, which was the most I'd hoped for. The aunts were less cautious. Gordana had asked me, at the holiday dinner the year I started the program, whether I planned to go back and get a real degree afterward. I was 18. I didn't say anything. I finished the degree in 5 years with a good academic record. I passed the Landscape Architect Registration Examination, a multi-section professional licensing exam that, at the time, had a national first attempt pass rate of around 60%. On my first attempt, I went to work at Halverson and Briggs and spent 2 years learning how public sector work actually operated, how to navigate city permitting, how to coordinate with civil engineers and contractors and parks departments, how to write specifications that would hold up in the field. Then I went out on my own. None of this had changed the family's assessment. I want to tell you about one specific incident because it matters to what comes later. About a year before the Vera Garden project, I had completed the redesign of a neighborhood pocket park in the city's northwest district, a space called Hallstad Green that had been a neglected corner of a residential block, repurposed through a city parks initiative. The project had a budget of $210,000 and had involved a complex negotiation between the Parks Department, the adjacent neighborhood association, and the city's infrastructure team because of some drainage issues on the site that needed to be addressed before the landscape design could be built out. I had managed all of that. The finished park had been written up in the Regional Planning magazine as an example of how small public spaces could serve a disproportionately large social function. The article had my name in it. I had sent the link to my mother. She had sent it to the aunts group message. Gordana had responded, "Nice. That's a sweet little park." Not, "That's a significant project." Not, "Your niece managed a $250,000 city contract." Sweet little park. I had put my phone down and gone for a walk, and when I came back I'd made tea and sat at my drafting table and worked for 3 hours, and eventually the feeling had worn off, the way it always did, because I had learned that feelings about what the aunts thought were not useful at a drafting table. But they accumulated. They built up the way silt builds up, slowly, quietly, in a place where you can't easily drain it. The comment at the November dinner was not the worst thing any of them had ever said to me. It wasn't even close to the worst. But it landed in a way that the others hadn't, because by the time Gordana said it, I already knew what was inside that folder in my car, and I had already decided that I was going to let the December meeting do what the December meeting was going to do without any intervention from me, and the distance between that knowledge and that table felt, in the moment, like a physical thing, something I was carrying in my chest that I could not set down. Nothing to show for it. I drove home that evening, and I took the folder out of the car, and I set it on my drafting table, and I looked at the cover sheet for a moment. Vosich Design Studio. Vera Pavich Memorial Garden. Birchfield Memorial Design, client. The city's seal in the corner. The approval stamp. Then I put the folder in a drawer, made dinner, and went to bed. The 3 weeks between that dinner and the December contractor meeting were ordinary weeks, professionally. I had a site visit for the 4th public park, the one under construction about 40 miles out, and a client meeting for a residential project, and a call with a city parks coordinator about a future bid. I worked my regular hours and did my regular work, and I did not think about the December meeting more than I had to, because thinking about it too much would have made me anxious in a way that wasn't useful. I did, at one point, have a conversation with Birchfield's project manager, a steady, organized woman named Sandra, who'd managed several of my projects, about how the meeting would run. Standard procedure. She would introduce the project, the contractor would walk the family through the design plans and construction timeline, questions would be addressed. Sandra knew I was the design architect. She did not know, at this point, that the memorial was for my grandmother, or that the family gathering for the meeting was my family. I had not told her.
I want to be honest about that.
I had made the decision to let the situation unfold without staging it, and that meant not briefing Sandra, which meant she was going to encounter the connection the same way everyone else was, in the room, when it happened. I told myself that was the cleanest way. I still think it was. I arrived at the community center on the day of the December meeting at 12:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled start time of 1 o'clock. I wore work clothes, my usual dark trousers, a Goodwill jacket, the kind of clothes I wore to any client-adjacent professional meeting. I had my project binder. I had my set of the approved plans, rolled in their cardboard tube. I went into the meeting room, which was a mid-sized conference space in the community center that the parks liaison had reserved for the meeting. There was a long table with chairs, a projector screen at one end, and a folding side table where Sandra had set up the project materials. I set my binder on the table and my plan tube against the wall and took a seat near the middle. The contractor arrived next. Tomasz was a compact, methodical man in his mid-50s who had worked with Birchfield on 3 previous projects. He brought his own copy of the plans. He nodded at me, recognized me from our earlier site visit, shook my hand. "The architect," he said in the way contractors say it, respectful, professional, very slightly formal. I said yes. We talked briefly about the site access schedule. The family began arriving at about 1:05. My Aunt Gordana came first. She was wearing a coat I recognized from Christmases past, and she had her phone out and was saying something to whoever was behind her, which turned out to be my Aunt Petra and Petra's daughter Natalija. Biljana arrived 30 seconds later with her husband Marco, who I'd always liked without ever finding a way to talk to easily. My mother was the last of the family to arrive. She came in alone, slightly hurried, looking for somewhere to put her coat. She spotted me at the table and something moved across her face, a half-recognition, a recalibration, because she had not been told I would be at this meeting. Nobody in the family had been told I would be at this meeting. As far as they knew, this was a project meeting between them and the contractor and the planning firm. They were the clients, commissioning a memorial for their mother, and they had come to see the plans for the thing they were building. The thing I had designed. Gordana swept the room with the quick, assessing look she always had in spaces she was entering for the first time, and her gaze landed on me, and she said, without particular warmth or coldness, "Lena, what are you doing here?" "I'm part of the project," I said. She looked at Petra.
Petra looked at me.
Neither of them said anything else, because Sandra had begun calling the room to order from the front, welcoming everyone, introducing herself and Birchfield, explaining the agenda.
"Take a seat," she said.
"We'll begin in just a moment." We all sat down. I sat across from my aunts. My mother sat down the table from me, in a chair from which she could see both me and the screen at the front without turning. Natalija sat beside Petra. Marco sat beside Biljana. Tomasz sat near the projection screen. I sat with my project binder in front of me and my hands flat on the table. Sandra thanked everyone for coming and gave a brief overview of where the project stood. City approval had been granted, contractor was confirmed, construction timeline had been established for early spring. Then she said she wanted to introduce the design architect, who would speak briefly about the concept before Tomasz walked through the construction details. She gestured toward me. I stood up. The room did not make a sound. Not a dramatic silence, not a theatrical pause, just the specific quiet of a room in which several people are rapidly rearranging and understanding. My Aunt Gordana's face did not change immediately. It shifted through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. The first was blankness. The second was something I would describe as an effort to locate the situation on a map she trusted. The third was something that happened in her throat, which she covered with a small, compressed gesture that in anyone else I might have called the beginning of wanting to say something and choosing not to. Aunt Petra looked at Gordana. Then she looked back at me. Her hands, which had been folded on the table, separated and she placed them flat, the same way mine were, which I noticed because it was such a specific and involuntary thing to do. Biljana had been pouring coffee from the thermos Sandra had set out on the side table.
She stopped.
She didn't put the thermos down for a moment. She just stopped. My mother looked at the table. I said, "Thank you, Sandra." My voice was even. It felt even. "I'm Lena Vasic. I'm the principal architect at Vasic Design Studio, and I've been working with Birchfield on the design for the Vera Pavich Memorial Garden for the past 8 months. I paused for exactly the length of time it took to let that sentence settle. I want to start by saying that this project has meant a great deal to me professionally. I'll leave it at that for now, and if you have questions about my connection to the project, I'm happy to answer them after the presentation. I looked at the room as a whole, not at the ants specifically. What I'd like to do now is walk you through the design concept. Tomasz stood and unrolled the plans onto the table. The plans were large, 2 sheets of 30 by 40-inch drafting paper, which Tomasz anchored at the corners with small weights he kept in his jacket pocket for exactly this purpose. The drawing was clear and detailed. The curving gravel path, the central sitting area, the stone bench, the planting beds marked and labeled, the rose anchors indicated at the 4 corners of the main bed, the perimeter plantings in their layered arrangement, the small inset plaque position marked at the base of the bench. I walked them through it methodically. The path material and its reason: gravel over compacted base for drainage and for the specific sound it makes underfoot, which is a small sensory thing but one I had thought about. The sitting area dimensions, size to accommodate a wheelchair comfortably alongside a standing visitor. The planting selections, and here I named the rose variety, which was the same variety my grandmother had grown in her yard, which I had confirmed through 2 research calls and 1 nursery visit, and I said it plainly. The climbing rose variety at the main bed is the same one Vera Povich grew in her yard at her home in Millbrook. I confirmed this through family records and sourced the heritage stock from a specialty nursery about 60 miles from here. Gordana's jaw was doing something very still. It had the quality of effort. I continued. The stone benches material, local limestone, quarried from the same county where the community center stood, so that the bench was, in a very literal sense, made from the same ground the memorial occupied. The plaque. The seasonal interest calendar, which I had laid out in a small supplementary sheet that Tomasz distributed, what would be flowering or showing color in each month. This garden is not going to have a dead season, I said. There will be something happening every month of the year. That was important to me for this particular space. I hadn't intended to say to me. I had intended to say for this design. But the words came out the way they came out. Sandra was watching me from her seat near the projection screen. She had the expression of someone who has just received information in a setting where the information cannot be fully processed in real time. I finished the design overview. Tomasz took it from there, moving into the construction sequence: site preparation, base installation, hardscape first, then planting, then the bench and plaque last, as they always came last. He was thorough and precise, and it was clear he had read the plans carefully. At one point, he gestured to a detail in the drainage layering beneath the central path and said, "This is solid spec work. Comes in under budget, and it's going to hold. I've built from plans that didn't think through the drainage, and you pay for it in 3 years when the path shifts. This one won't shift." He said it as a professional observation. He said it the way contractors say things they mean, simply and technically.
But the room received it as something else.
Nat Elijah was looking at the plans with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not skepticism, not reassessment exactly, more like the specific look of someone who is doing a calculation and finding that the answer is not what they had expected. Marco, Boljana's husband, leaned forward slightly and looked at the planting layout. "These are the roses," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. Slowly. Boljana had put the thermos down. I don't know exactly when. I hadn't been watching her. But the thermos was on the table now, and her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the plan sheet with an expression that I can only describe as someone arriving somewhere they hadn't planned to arrive. Sandra, who had been absorbing all of this quietly from her corner of the room, cleared her throat gently and said, "I should note for the record, and I want to be transparent because I think it's relevant, that Birchfield contracted Vosich Design Studio based on their public portfolio and their track record with municipal memorial projects. This project is the 3rd memorial garden Lena has completed under our firm's management, and both previous projects have received city commendations."
She paused.
I was not aware until just this moment that there was a personal connection between the designer and the family commissioning the memorial. That's a significant thing, and I want to make sure everyone has a moment to take it in. Sandra was good at her job. That was her way of saying, whatever is happening in this room right now, I am acknowledging it professionally so that it has a place to land. Gordana spoke for the first time since the presentation began. Her voice was careful. Controlled in the way that things are controlled, when the controlling is costing something.
Lena, she said.
When did you take this project? About 8 months ago, I said, when Birchfield brought me the brief. And you knew it was for, she stopped. Started again. You knew it was for your grandmother. Her name was on the brief, I said. The room was very quiet. Not the theatrical silence of a reveal engineered for maximum effect. Just the genuine, specific quiet of several people sitting with a fact they hadn't had before and trying to determine what it changed. Why didn't you say anything?
Petra asked.
Her voice was smaller than her usual voice. Not unkind, just smaller. I wanted the work to speak for itself, I said. That's all. Sandra moved the meeting forward gently. There were logistics to confirm, a timeline to sign off on, a materials approval that needed to happen. We addressed all of it. The signatures were obtained. The spring start date was confirmed. Tomasz rolled the plans carefully and handed one set to Sandra and one set to me, and I put mine in the cardboard tube and capped it. At the end of the meeting, Sandra pulled up one additional slide on the projector, a slide I hadn't seen, which turned out to be a portfolio slide she used with families to give context on the designer's background. It had my headshot, my license number, a list of completed projects. The 3 parks were listed. The schoolyard redesign and its regional award were listed. The 2 memorial gardens, both with Birchfield, were listed. Nat Elijah read the slide. I saw her read it, her eyes moving left to right across each line. Marco read it. Biljana read it, sitting very still. The meeting ended at 2:30. People gathered their coats and their bags with the slightly careful movements of people who are navigating a room where the floor has shifted underfoot without anyone saying so directly. Sandra was warm and efficient and thanked everyone. Tomasz shook hands around the table and left. Sandra gathered her materials and asked me quietly, as she was leaving, whether I was all right. I said I was. She said, "It was a beautiful presentation. The design is wonderful, Lena." Then she left too. There were 6 of us left in the room. My mother, my 3 aunts, Nat Elijah, and Marco. Marco was the first one to say anything. He looked at the space where the plans had been spread, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Your grandmother would have loved that garden." His voice was plain and sincere, the way Marco's voice always was. It was the most direct thing anyone had said in the room in the previous 90 minutes, and it landed on me in a way I hadn't prepared for, which I felt in the particular way you feel things you haven't prepared for, in the chest, in the throat, in the specific pressure behind the eyes that I did not let become anything more than that. "Thank you," I said. "I hope so." My mother came to me. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on my arm, briefly, and then took it away, and I could see that she was doing the same work I was doing, keeping things contained, staying present, not letting the room become something it didn't need to become. Gordana was standing near the door with her coat. She was looking at me with an expression that I had not seen on her face before in 29 years of family dinners and holidays and the small accumulated weather of an extended family's life. It was not quite an apology. It was something before an apology, or maybe underneath one. The particular expression of someone who has been wrong in a specific and legible way and is standing in the full knowledge of that wrongness without yet having found words for it. She said, "Lena." Then she stopped. "You don't have to say anything right now," I said. I meant it. I wasn't being cold. I was being accurate. She nodded. Her throat moved. Petra had sat back down. She was looking at the table. "The award," she said almost to herself. "The school one." "A regional planning award, yes," I said. "For the Hallstad schoolyard." "You sent your mother the article." "I did." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I didn't read it properly." "I know," I said. That was as close to an accounting as the room was able to manage that afternoon, and I think it was the right amount. These were not bad people. They were people who had been wrong, and who now knew they had been wrong, and who were sitting in a room with the evidence of that wrongness spread flat on a table in 30 by 40 inches of ink and paper. The correction had already happened. Whatever came next was going to come in private conversations, in quiet moments, in the slow process of people revising their internal maps when the terrain has shifted. I didn't need to be in the room for that part. I picked up my binder and my plan tube. I said goodbye to each person by name. I hugged my mother. I put on my jacket. Nat Elijah caught me near the door. She was 4 years older than me, a manager now at the insurance company, and we had grown up within the same family system with a different understanding of what that system expected from us. She said, "I've been to Hallstad Green." A pause. I didn't know. I mean, I knew it was there. I went with a friend's kids in the summer. I just didn't know. "That's how it's supposed to work," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "It's a really good park." "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." I walked out of the community center and into the cold December afternoon. The parking lot was half full. The sky was the particular white of winter afternoons when the light is flat and even and everything is very clear without being bright. I put the plan tube in my back seat. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off. Then I started the car and drove. In the weeks that followed, the family's behavior shifted in the gradual, non-dramatic way that families shift when something real has been established. Gordana called me 2 weeks after the meeting. It was a Sunday afternoon. The call was not long, maybe 12 minutes, and it covered, in the careful language of a woman who does not apologize easily, several things. That she had looked at my portfolio online after the meeting. That she had read the article about Hallstad Green properly this time. That she had looked up the other parks. That she had shown Petra the planning award citation, which was available on the Regional Association's website, and which listed the scope of the project and the judging criteria and the specific elements of the design that had been recognized. She said, near the end of the call, that she thought she had not understood what I did. "No," I said. "You didn't." "I'm sorry for that," she said. "I know," I said. We said goodbye. After I put my phone down, I sat for a while, and then I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window and watched the street. A family was walking a dog on the other side of the road. The dog was investigating a fence post with great intensity. The 2 kids were arguing about something in the peaceable way kids argue when they don't really care who wins. I drank my coffee. Petra called 3 days after that. Her call was shorter and more practical. She asked whether she could come and see the Hallstad schoolyard sometime, and whether I would show her what I'd done there. I said yes. We went on a Saturday in January, when the ground was frozen and the plantings were dormant, and I walked her through the site and explained the drainage solution and the play area surfacing and the way the perimeter hedging would grow in over the next 2 seasons to create a visual buffer from the street without blocking the natural light into the space. She asked good questions. She was quiet for most of it in a way that was not uncomfortable. Before we left, she stood in the middle of the central path and looked around at the space and said, "I keep thinking about what I said. About the degree." "The real degree conversation," I said. "Yes." She looked at the bare branches of the young trees I'd specified along the west edge. "I thought I was helping." "I know you did," I said. It was the most I had to offer her, and I think she understood that. We drove back in quiet and parted warmly in the parking lot, with the acknowledgement of 2 people who have arrived somewhere new and aren't quite sure yet what the new place is called. The garden was built in April and May of the following spring. I visited the site 3 times during construction, twice for scheduled inspections, and once informally, on a weekday afternoon when the rose plantings were going in, because I wanted to see it. Tomasz was there for the last planting day. He showed me the installation. The roses were bare root at that stage, just the root structure and the beginning of the canes, but they were healthy stock from the nursery, and they were placed exactly where the plans indicated. "Good bones," Tomasz said, meaning the roses. "They'll establish well." The garden was formally dedicated in June. The family gathered. There was a small ceremony, a few words from the community center's director, a moment of quiet, and then the unveiling of the bench with its plaque. The plaque bore my grandmother's name, her dates, and a single line that the family had chosen. She grew things that lasted. I stood near the back of the small group that had gathered, and I looked at the garden. The path, the beds, the bench, the roses beginning their first season of growth, and I thought about Grandma Vera letting me sit at her kitchen table and draw. I thought about the silence she had made a room out of. I thought about what it means to leave something in the ground that will outlast you, and how that is, in the end, the only kind of showing that lasts. Here is the thing about quietly doing your work. It does not protect you from being dismissed. It does not prevent the comments, the comparisons, the casual cruelties of people who love you but have decided, in the privacy of their own framework, that you don't quite measure up. Quiet work is not armor. It's not a defense. The people who will misread you are going to misread you, for exactly as long as they misread you, and no amount of competence performed in private is going to change that faster than it changes. But it accumulates. The plans are always in the car. The license is always on file. The work is in the ground in the city, in the parks that exist because someone thought carefully about drainage and rose varieties and the width of a path that needs to accommodate a wheelchair. It is real before anyone in your family knows it is real, and it will be real after, and the moment when those two realities collide, the one they have of you and the one that is simply true, is not something you engineer. It is something you wait for and do your work in the meantime and let it arrive in its own time in its own room. My grandmother grew things that lasted. She never did it loudly. She just kept her hands in the soil and let the roses come back each year until the roses outlasted her. That is the thing I am most grateful to have learned. Not from a classroom, not from a license, not from any credential anyone could have pointed to at a table. From a woman who understood that the work speaks when the time is right. That's my story. A folder in a car, a rolled set of plans, and a climbing rose that was always going to come back. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your answer. Is there something you have done quietly, something real and accomplished and true, that the people closest to you don't know about yet? A credential, a project, a skill, something you've never announced, that just exists, waiting for the right moment to be seen? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them. I think about them. And I think you'll find you're not alone. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.